Okay, I think we can start, and in the meantime we break the ice saying hello and thank you for being here to this policy session of the Policy Outreach Committee on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services on the way to COP30. A few introductory words. Well, you all know the activities of the Policy Outreach Committee, and every year at the annual conference we have a session. This year we went for this topic on the way to COP30 because it's a circle closing somehow. I was mentioning in the opening the Earth Summit of 1992, and this year we will be back in Brazil for COP30 in Belém. It's a circle closing. At the same time we need to close it, not simply going back to places but also finding solutions. And for the moment the circle seems to be larger and larger, and we never get to the solutions. This year is particularly interesting in my view because of the location and because of the strong biodiversity component and attention that Brazil pays on this topic. So it's an occasion to really make the two crises talk to each other. If I may use 3 seconds for a personal anecdote, in Baku I had a meeting with some high Brazilian government representative, and he was asking for ideas on COP, and I said, this is the topic. You have a unique opportunity to put the focus, the spotlight on biodiversity, because the biodiversity crisis is as important as the climate crisis in my view. So let's see what they will decide to do, but certainly it is a problem to be discussed. And last year in Baku, at COP29, we came back with something, not much, but at least an agreement on how to make Article 6 operational. And I think this can open the way to the use of carbon markets in a more consistent way in the future, but probably can also be useful for biodiversity issues and for this link between the topics. Okay, end of my introduction. Now I want to keep silent and listen to our panelists, because it's a real pleasure to have today 3 for the moment, but there should be 4 super experts in this area. So Philippe Tulkens, Alejandro Caparrós, and Katinka Holtsmark. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. We are actually waiting also for Navrud. I hope he finds his way or he's not taken by other meetings. A few words to introduce our panelists. Philippe is the head of unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Research and Innovation, where he leads research and innovation in the fields of climate, biodiversity, and environmental observation. He's deputy manager of the EU Mission on Adaptation to Climate Change. His unit served as the EU focal point to both the IPCC and the IPBES. He has a strong background in environmental science, sustainability, and international research policy, and plays a key role in bridging science and climate resilient decision-making at both European and global levels. I will start with Philippe, and then I will move to the other speakers. And first of all, Philippe, it's a pleasure, real pleasure, sorry for the shoulders, to have you with us today, and it was a real pleasure last year because this is somehow the continuation of the successful event we had last year. And I will proceed with 2 rounds of questions. In the first round 10 minutes for each panelist, and in the second round 5 minutes. Say the first question will be more on the current situation, and then the second question on more practical implementation. So the question I would like to break the ice with for Philippe is, how can EU research and innovation policies catalyze global action for biodiversity and climate integration in the lead up to COP30? Philippe, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Simone. First, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to speak clearly, and if not, please raise your hand and so on. Thank you very much for inviting the European Commission to this discussion today. I'm currently attending in Rimini, in Italy, the 7th European Climate Change Adaptation Conference, and I'm very grateful to the organizer of EAERE conference for allowing all online interventions. So it allows me to be at two places at the same time. Your conference is very important and highly policy relevant. I looked at the program, it's impressive. And before getting into the answer to your question, I would like to ask very frankly whether each session of this big conference that you have in Bergen will produce like a few key policy messages that could be sent to the European Commission, as I strongly believe that we definitely need more economics and the best economists to guide EU climate policy and environmental policies in general. These are very tough times for scientific knowledge. I don't think I need to explain the details of this. And also for economics. It's very confusing for non-economists to see how the different policies are being shaped up and what is the knowledge that is behind, if any knowledge. And we really need sound economics to guide our society towards competitiveness and sustainability. And I insist on this last word, because I see that since the new Commission started, while the mandate is very clear, it's about competitiveness and sustainability, some actors tend to forget the second dimension and the complexity of the issue that has several dimensions. For instance, the new growth model of the EU, the Green Deal, it's the President who qualified it as such, is not sufficiently well defined to guarantee that the targets of the Green Deal will be met. Your association, the findings from the Congress can help this now and in the coming years in guiding the Commission, in providing knowledge that will help us in implementing this transition. Now getting to your question, I mean, how can we help? Of course, through research innovation, it's quite clear what we produce is knowledge. There is a lot of knowledge, and the scientific community has already done a lot in this regard. But I would say, to reply in few words, that the knowledge needs to be further developed and integrated. You know that, for instance, in the EU biodiversity strategy, the link between biodiversity and climate action is very clear. And we need to account for this in all relevant research work. Ecosystem restoration under this strategy on the biodiversity supports both carbon sequestration and biodiversity gain, laying groundwork for future biodiversity-friendly carbon offset projects and aligning nature-based solutions with EU climate policies. If you want another example, Target 8 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework reminds us that biodiversity conservation is not just an environmental goal, it's also a climate solution. We need to prioritize nature-based solutions like restoring wetlands, protecting forests and our ocean, conserving peatlands. We can enhance carbon sequestration and reduce disaster risks and build long-term resilience. As the carbon markets develop, Target 8 of the Kunming-Montreal Protocol urges that offset strategies must not undermine biodiversity. There's a tendency, even in some research circles, to oversimplify and to reduce this complex problem to too few dimensions. And I'm strongly pleading here for addressing the systemic aspect of the issue, keep the complexity while proposing solutions that can be implemented without losing the complexity of the response. So we need to align also climate finance with biodiversity safeguards and promote co-benefits accounting, ensuring that climate action also strengthens ecosystems. It should not replace them with harmful practices like monoculture plantation or land grabs. So We know that we cannot solve the climate challenge if we do not have nature on our side. We know that we will not be climate neutral if we do not transform our economy in the EU and globally towards a nature positive economy. But this word itself is still controversial. I say this because we are in touch with research and innovation outcomes funded by the EU and others, and we read some of your scientific publication or at least the abstracts, because we don't have the opportunity to read a lot. But from that point to reaching out to those who shape EU and national economic policy in all relevant ministries is still a very difficult challenge. You know that if we go to another level, the links between climate and biodiversity are duly recognized in IPBES and IPCC. I'm sure you're aware of the Nexus report, which is a key thematic assessment of the interlinkages among biodiversity, water, food, and health in the context of climate change. So, if we do not change, we will fail, as the unaccounted costs of current approaches are estimated to be at least 10 to 25 trillion per year. But I'll be frank here, two mainstream macroeconomists accept this figure. Those I meet don't. Do you discuss this matter with the European Economic Association or other association of economists to bring consensus on the need to address these and on economic aspects in particular? So, in the context of integrating climate and biodiversity objectives, it is increasingly clear that we need better analytical tools, especially modeling frameworks that can jointly address both climate and biodiversity dimensions. And this is what we do in our research program. Traditionally, climate and biodiversity have often been treated in parallel policy silos, this I said already, and this fragmentation is also mirrored in the modeling community, where integrated assessment models and economic forecasting tools frequently overlook the ecological dynamics, species loss, or nature-based feedback loops. Of course, it's complicated to put this in a model, but it should not be forgotten. The latest IPCC report from AR6 and the findings of the IPBES IPCC joint workshop underscore that climate change and biodiversity loss are deeply interconnected. But you know this well, probably you contributed to that report. So, as climate change is now the third largest driver of biodiversity loss, while degraded ecosystem in turn undermine climate mitigation and adaptation capacity, the interaction between both demand a more coherent, systemic policy and research approach. This is what we try to do, and we have done that in Horizon 2020 calls and in current calls, supporting the development of components of integrated assessment models to improve the situation. So that's what we can do from the research viewpoint, but ultimately these investments also need to support holistic decision-making, where trade-offs between emissions from land use, biodiversity, and human well-being are explicitly assessed. This is, I would say, sorry for having long here and probably answered too many aspects at one time, but to summarize, we are investing in this. Communities in the academic world need to team up to provide consensus messages, and also the tools need to be improved so that we can reinforce the case for addressing together biodiversity and climate change.
Thank you, Philippe. It was all very clear apart from the last summary, because your voice at the very end was fading away, but since we are so clear in the first part, I got the three messages in any case. So, thanks a lot. I will now move...
Just have some slides for that.
No, I mean, it's okay with you? You have slides?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know you had slides. Okay, I can now move to Alejandro. Alejandro Caparrós, wait a second, because I have some dated information. Last minute updated information. Alejandro is at the University of Durham, where he's professor in the Department of Economics and co-director of the Center for Environmental and Energy Economics. He was previously director at the Institute for Public Goods and Policies of the Spanish National Research Council. He participated in a large number of research projects funded by the European Commission and national agencies, and worked as consultant for the World Bank, United States Statistics Division, and local entities. Was one of the lead authors of the chapters on international cooperation for the 6th assessment report of IPCC. And I finished my time. I was trying to go slowly.
Go ahead.
In case you could fix it.
I think I fixed it.
Okay, great. So Alejandro, as you could understand from my words, is certainly expert on the topics at stake today. And in this case, I would like to ask him what lessons from international cooperation are most relevant for integrating biodiversity in the global climate architecture. A simple question to start with.
So thank you very much. As you see, I cheated a little bit. He sent me the question first beforehand, so I prepared some slides on that. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I think this is working, isn't it? Can I move? You can use this. So, because as it's said, it is a very simple question. But actually, so we know climate change and biodiversity are related, and we actually were very aware of that when all this started. So this is when, in Rio 92, where we are going back now in a few years, so there two conventions came out, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the CBD, so the Convention on Biodiversity. And there already in Article 2 of the Convention on Climate Change, we actually said that the ultimate objective of this convention and any related instrument, that means also the Paris Agreement, all of them are part of the convention. The ultimate goal is to achieve the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous earthquake interference with the climate system. But we added, within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt and address climate change. That was the first goal of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But then basically they started working, going forward. These two conventions basically follow different paths. So 10 years later, basically, they had diverged a lot. So now we had the Convention on Climate Change, which has established economic incentives for reforestation, afforestation, economic incentives for many things that affected the forests. But the Convention on Biodiversity had no economic incentives. But then, together with a lawyer, Jacquemont, we prepared a paper in Caparrós and Jacquemont, but we had several papers on this topic. We said, look, we are creating incentives on one topic, climate change, and not on biodiversity, there will be conflicts. So we said that, like 10 years after the initial movement, and then we said, well, incentives for reforestation, monoculture plantations are the main risk for biodiversity that we're setting up. We are also, for avoided degradation, it's going to be less bad, so it's not so bad. Forest management is the only area where they actually align the incentives. But it's just a coincidence, because we are not incentivizing biodiversity. That's a big problem. So we also said, look, the existing limits in the Kyoto Protocol, that's why we needed a lawyer, and in the Marrakesh Accords, they're simply not going to work. So there are some limits, but they are not going to work, so this is going to create the false incentives. So we also said, well, it is not a good idea to go project by project, like the CDM said. You should go on a more regional or national scale, because biodiversity needs larger scales. So we said you should scale up this thing. It's dangerous to go project by project. Then we made some applications. These are also published in 2010, 2011. These were either theoretical studies, as the first one, or there were micro-applications, showing that, in fact, this was going to happen. In our micro-application, they showed us it's going to happen. We are going to create false incentives for carbon sequestration, which are not going to align with incentives for biodiversity. So now we have historical data, and we can see what actually happened. So while the CDM focused on the energy sector, it's like only 1% of the CDMs were in the forestry sector. So on that side, well, not a lot of bad has happened, because we didn't see a lot of CDM in this sector. But on the contrary, we have the voluntary market. And here about 40%, 45%, depending on the source, are forest related. So most of the it's by far the sector with the highest volume in the voluntary markets. And here we have a paper you all probably know in Science by West and Al, 2023 that says that they had almost no climate impact. Basically, it's business as usual in the part of climate. Now we have another paper which is unpublished, can come out very soon. So in Almond, they have worked on about 30,000 different projects. So they have studied all 45 countries. It's a huge thing again. And they have shown that they actually harmed biodiversity. So we had created a system where we had no impact on climate change and we harmed biodiversity. So that's kind of a job well done. So now, job well done, but this is not working there. Oops. So now we have a fresh start. So now we have in COP29, we are starting again. So now we are setting up, in Rules 29 we set Article 6, we agreed finally to have some rules. Not well defined for the moment, so there is some extra work, but we have them, as you mentioned, they are there. So we have 6.2 for IPBES, international transfer mitigation outcomes, that's between countries. We have 6.4, where all the voluntary markets can come in potentially. In principle, that's what we hope. It integrates and continues the CDM, so that's a good thing. And then we have the 6.8, which is the less developed one, is where you really can link to biodiversity. Then, again, but this is a bit more aligned this time in COP16, because the Biodiversity Convention also has the COPs. They also go on, it's just a bit slower than COP16. And they started talking about putting economic incentives. For the first time, they started about that, but they didn't approve it. But fortunately, now we have for the Rio Convention and Joint Capacity Building Program, so they're working together, they're talking to each other. So we're a bit better than last time. So this is the basic idea. We have a fresh start. We should basically look back what we have done in the past and try to improve it this time. That's the first message. And the second one is, well, the EU has pushed a lot on EU certification. So we have pushed a lot on these new rules, and now, as was mentioned before, we have this provision that in Europe, if you want to have a CDR, you have to have no harm on biodiversity, something very similar as in 6.4. So Europe, it was actually Europe pushing for that. So we have been successful in COP29. There is a no harm provision or something very similar. So now the question we have in Europe is, do we want to accept these international CDMs in our system in Europe? So we have decided in the past that no, we don't accept international CDRs coming from the forestry sector. Now we are opening up the debate whether we want in Europe, and in particular in the UNED, to accept a CDR from forests. We are debating whether we accept them only nationally or actually also internationally. So this is a debate that is going to open, and I would like you to, that's the reason I had actually slides. I want you to imagine two worlds. So first world with option A, where EU announces in November that they're not going to intervene in international CDR, so we're going to be out. So if we're out there, basically what's going to happen, that Article 6 will be defined by China, and the rules, the details will be defined by those active in the markets, because you only make them details once you implement it, will be defined by China, and from COP30 forwards, probably it's going to be the US back on time. So this is looking for, imagine that we are looking at climate policy on the 1st of January 2051. Okay, we're 25 years from now. So, but then the EU is the only country in the world, or the only region in the world that has net zero emissions domestically. That means we have been out of international negotiations for quite some time. We have no chair in international negotiation. Why would we? We have no emissions anymore. We don't have any further reductions to do. We don't do any transfers significantly to anyone. So we are irrelevant, completely irrelevant. So that's one path. Well, biodiversity protection, we're not, well, I put some points into there. In option B, as the European Union goes significantly into it, we take in this international CDR for forest into our system. Well, we are very relevant because there is no relevant buyer right now out there. Because there have been a lot of small agreements with Norway, with Switzerland, with Liechtenstein, but they're not really big buyers. So the EU would be actually setting the rules for that. We could push, as we have done, to more biodiversity protection. We will still be emitting something in 2051. It would be X% of our emissions, but very little in the world, because now we're emitting like 6%. If we're still emitting a 20% out of that, we will be at 1% of the global soup, not a lot. And we may be even sharing the negotiations, be still below.
Thank you, Alejandro. Very bright look into the future.
That's it.
Scary at some point, but yes, very interesting. I now turn to Katinka. Katinka is at the University of Oslo, is assistant professor in the Department of Economics. She obtained her PhD in economics from the institution in 2015. Her research is on applied microeconomic theory within environmental and public economics, particularly on the design of climate policies, carbon markets, and the dynamics of international cooperation. Katinka has been a visiting researcher at CESIFO, where she contributed to studies on emission trading system and green technology investment incentives. And recent publications offer insight into how economic incentives and institutional design can shape effective and equitable climate and biodiversity strategies. So this links perfectly to the previous presentation. Katinka, in your case, my simple question would be, how can applied economic theory guide the design of policy instruments that address both climate change and biodiversity? $1 million question.
Yes, thank you for the question and for a very nice introduction and for inviting me here. I'm in no way an expert on biodiversity, but my research is in the political economy side of climate policy. So I will focus on, in trying to answer your question, I think I will get closer to an answer towards the end, but I will focus on one key insight from environmental economics. I think I risk being kind of a parody of an economist, but maybe that's okay in this, but that's pricing. So using the price, not necessarily a Pigouvian price, but using a price to making it more expensive to emit climate gases or destroy nature and biodiversity. Because I think, so let me take one step back. So to try to remind us of what's the role or what's the key effect of pricing emissions. Like putting a tax on driving with a fossil car. Well, it's to push everyone, all firms, all individuals, towards other activities or towards reducing their emissions or biodiversity loss effects or whatever negative externality you want to pinpoint. But the key to why economists are so or always talk about pricing, often talk about pricing, is of course that it does this without kind of prescribing an alternative for each individual, for each firm. It just says, I want you to reduce your emissions, but you have to find the best alternative for you. For different individuals, firms, there are of course a large set of different alternatives. And for one household, moving can be the best alternative, while for another is shifting to an electric vehicle, and there are 6,000 other alternatives. So using prices to push each individual towards what's less costly for them or least costly for them solves a gigantic information problem for the government. And I think these insights and I think one main insight over the last decades from looking at international climate cooperation and unilateral action for climate policy, for climate mitigation, is that people, voters, politicians, countries are really not willing to do very costly actions. So in order to make something happen, it's a basic that we need to keep costs as low as possible. And to do that for society as a whole, in climate mitigation, but also in other environmental problems, pricing is the key instrument. And why? So, and of course, in the simplest economic model that you learn in Econ 101, which is maybe when you learn about externalities the first time as an economist, you typically have a general equilibrium model with two goods, for example, and one of them has a negative externality in production or consumption. In that model, you can use a price to reduce that negative externality, to internalize that negative externality, or you can use a subsidy for the alternative good. And the outcome is the same, except there's a distributional difference, maybe. In the real world, there is a distributional difference, but it's also a difference in that the subsidy would increase costs because you choose one or maybe two or maybe even 10 out of the alternatives that which are 600. So, and there are many. I will get to biodiversity and the link to biodiversity in a while here, but there are many examples, I think, of where we see that this insight that you can use subsidies has kind of saved politicians from a politically very difficult situation, which is that pricing is politically super difficult. Here in Norway, we have had a huge shift towards EVs over the last decade, maybe most importantly, driven by subsidies, large subsidies for EVs. Of course, you can get exactly the same shift from the fossil activity to the clean alternative by subsidizing the clean alternative as you can from pricing the fossil one. The difference is that we have probably increased the number of car purchases in Norway by a lot by choosing that alternative, and we have disincentivized investments in all other alternatives like car sharing, like electric bikes, and of course the transport sector is one example. We have the same problem in all sectors where you try to use subsidies or other alternative measures. Of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. It means they work differently. So I think my main point by this long story about pricing is that there is no alternative policy instrument that can obtain the same effect as you can by pricing negative externalities. And I think this insight is extremely important for climate policy, but I think that it also is important when we try to tackle the perhaps even more difficult problem of biodiversity and degradation of nature more generally. Of course, for climate policy, it's often relatively simple to say what's the size of the externality. What PGU would tell us is that you have to put the price on the externality equal to the size. For any kind of project that destroys nature or biodiversity, that's much more difficult. So PGUian pricing is perhaps impossible. But that doesn't mean that using a price as a kind of lower limit will help at least exclude all projects where you know that the value of the project is lower than this lower bar that we can put a price on. So I think this is an important insight. And now getting to the question, trying to answer your question at least a little bit. The question is, how can we use, what policy instrument can we use to tackle both at the same time? Well, of course, as both the previous speakers has talked about, there is a strong link between activities that create carbon emissions and activities that destroy biodiversity. And sometimes that means that, I mean, the same instruments are good for both. We should, we can, and that's a good situation. But in many cases, that's not the case. In many cases, the alternatives to the fossil activity is really harmful for biodiversity. And that, from my perspective, really strengthens the argument for focusing on pricing of emissions instead of third and fourth best alternatives that create problems, like mandates for biofuels. And the Norwegian climate policy is strongly, we don't like to talk about this, but it's strongly contingent on Norway being the only country in the world that will solve its problems in terms of emissions by use of biofuels. It's clear for everyone that that's not a solution, that's not a long-term solution for the world, but for one country, it can of course be a solution. I think is relevant for thinking about EV subsidies or EV or electrification of the transport sector in other countries. Can we do that in a way where we avoid also increasing the use of energy in the transport sector a lot through our policy instruments. And I think it's of course relevant for renewable energy support systems that we should think about using, we should ideally use pricing as the instrument to change demand for renewable versus fossil energy, while using support schemes directed towards the positive externalities, which are there for technology development. That's of course easier said than done. It's not obvious how to do that, but trying to shift the instruments towards pricing for the demand side, support for technology, I think will be important in climate emissions, but also kind of will have the by-effect of giving better policies for biodiversity. Okay, so I think my summary is that pricing is difficult, and we as economists have maybe felt that for a long time we focused on this, and we made ourselves irrelevant in some sense. But that doesn't mean we should forget it, and it doesn't mean that there is an alternative. There are, in some cases, for many purposes, we need pricing. And I think both biodiversity loss and climate emissions it's impossible to get where we want without a very strong focus on prices.
Thanks a lot. Very clear viewpoint in defense of pricing. Actually reminds me of our first POC event in Florence long ago. Martin Weitzman, I remember Aldo, advocating for carbon pricing and saying, well, it's 100 years since Pigou came up with this idea, and we should also all be proud, but it's not going to solve it all. So somehow this reminds me of what Martin Weitzman used to say at that time. Our last speaker, we were a bit concerned not to have you, but you became our last speaker. I'm very happy that you're here. Is Stelle Navrud. Stelle is with the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. He's a professor in environmental resource economics. He has been a visiting researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, and University of New Mexico. He specializes, among other topics, in cost-benefit analysis and economic valuation of ecosystem services, biodiversity, environmental-related health impacts, and environmental impacts from climate change. He participated in more than 20 EU projects on these topics, and is also experienced in applied stated preference methods in different continents. He was a reviewer editor of the 5th IPCC assessment report and a member of the pool of experts for the IPBES. So given your expertise, you can expect a simple question as the others, and for being late, it will be even more difficult.
That's reasonable.
My question to you, Stelle, is to what extent the economic valuation of biodiversity and ecosystem services contributed to strengthen climate adaptation and biodiversity conservation strategies? So, did we manage?
So we can answer that in one sentence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Obviously.
I mean, solution is pricing, and then we use these valuation methods to find the right price.
Okay, thank you all.
So that's it. Okay, and the longer history is so I will see if I can get this to work.
Så hadde du en sånn jævlig sterk sånn.
All right, you see this? Yeah. Thank you for the question. It was my favorite subject to talk about economic valuation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And then the question is, how can that contribute? Oh, you might.
I like the title.
Ah, okay.
It's the same as 20 years ago.
Maybe I should borrow this.
It's not about you.
Okay.
You haven't shared?
That's it. Does it work? Do I need to run it from there? I can go ahead. Okay. And then it should work.
What did you call it? The next EAERE generation?
Yes.
Yeah.
There they are, out of the window.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yes. How can valuation contribute to strengthening the climate adaptation and biodiversity conservation strategies? So, yeah. Well,
In the middle, when you make it full screen, then your beamer, in the middle, when you make it full screen, then it will work. Then it will work.
in the middle.
No, first you have to make it full screen. In the middle. Middle screen, you have to make it full screen, and then the clicker will work. Yes.
Or maybe use the arrows on the keyboard. It's not working, sorry. That's why that don't work in my case.
Okay, I can do the arrows. That's fine. We can do the arrows.
But
Huh?
This one moves. This one moves.
The middle one.
The one
middle one does.
so it's the other ways.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, overall question is, when there is no prizes, there is no value, and of course we know that that's not true. So very much all the environmental valuation literature have actually, what they've done is to raise awareness of the kind of magnitude of these values. And so to get acceptance for using these valuation methods to price environment, I think we usually we would go around and use cost-benefit analysis. So, and we do cost-benefit analysis for, climate adaptation measures, nature-based solutions. We do it for nature preservation areas. So, for example, the last national park in Norway, which is the first rural national park just outside Oslo, that's like a national park. Even there is forest operations there, so that would be a loss. There would be biodiversity and recreation to preserve. So what we did there was a cost-benefit analysis for the environmental authorities, and of course they're very skeptical about these, stated preference surveys where we ask people's willingness to pay to preserve biodiversity. But in this case, many years ago, we actually did a stated preference survey of the exact same area. And then afterwards, we sent people the bills just to test if they actually were willing to pay what they said. So we used the actual willingness to pay, which was donation to the World Wildlife Fund, Fund for Nature, at that stage, to justify and document the environmental values. So the values of preserving biodiversity. This is basically biodiversity in these forest areas here in Norway. Roughly 50% of the terrestrial biodiversity is connected to this forest. In Norway in general, and this is an important contribution. Right?
what do you need to?
Just to continue on this one. Okay. Yeah. Can I now use this one? Or? Yeah. Use this. Okay. So these cost-benefit analysis guidelines are increasingly included in the policy-making process, and They also now start including these environmental prices. So in the UK you have the Treasury Green Book, you have German Environmental Agency's Unit Prices Handbook, Norwegian Minister of Finance has their handbook, and also the different ministries of transportation. And of course now, which we had some sessions yesterday, is also on the system environmental economic accounting, although I should say that in terms of welfare effects, some of these ecosystem services will not be counted in this system environmental economic accounts because it's based on exchange values, so market prices, which would cover the provisioning ecosystem services, but not the, for example, the some of the regulating and the cultural ecosystem services. Since we're in Norway, just give you a, you know, it's supposed to be the last wilderness area in Europe, Norway. But we kind of lost, so the dark green areas here are areas which is more than 5 kilometers from the nearest kind of technical installation. So it was 48% back in 1900. Now it's 11.5%. So if some of you might have taken the train from Oslo to Bergen, you pass through this largest area here in southern Norway, which is the Hardangervidda National Park. But you see most of these 11.5% is up here in northern Norway, where very few people live. So we had this, so journalists started digging up the number of development cases in Norway. And what they found is that the last 5 years there were 44,000 cases of development projects, which could be you know, wind turbines or vacational homes, which really account for the largest share of this. So, so these green dots here are all the development projects. Well, the last 5 years. And so what we were losing is 79 square meter per minute. That's what they lost the last 5 years. So the question is, could pricing of biodiversity stop some of this? And I'm pretty sure it could have. For the next years, we plan to develop 4,000 square kilometers, and 25% of that area is for vacation, more vacation homes. We currently have 500,000 vacation homes, and we are 5.5 million people, and 16% of it is inland or onshore wind. So we did a study kind of documenting this because the local communities, they will have income from these, from the vacation homes through, you know, the building activities and selling off property to the landowners. The problem is in this area, which is just north of Oslo, is the wild reindeer, which is a red-listed species. So, you know, some of this area will then be more like this, or at least already is. So there is roughly 7,500 vacation homes in that area. And there are plans to build 6,500 more. So what we did was to do a kind of accounting. You know, what are the net benefits to the local communities? And that comes out very positive, about 150 million euro net present value. Whereas if we account for the welfare loss to people, both those that live in these municipalities that where we have the vacation homes and those that own these cabins and the people in the larger Oslo area, then it's going to be a loss which is roughly 150,000 euro per vacation home. So, that is actually the price. So this is the tax you could actually put on the. So if you want to build a new vacation home, so you would have to pay 150,000 in a kind of nature tax. And there's been nature tax have been suggested in Norway in 5 national committees, and but it's still kind of, politicians are dragging their feet, and they're kind of saying that, well, that we don't know enough about what price we should set. But I know the alternative is, of course, having a price equal to zero, which will have very negative effects. So, finally, just to give you another example, still since we're in Norway. So this is where we actually get to use more or less pricing, but put it in cost-benefit analysis. So the National Coastal Administration do a lot of measures to avoid oil spills from ships, and those would of course have some big impacts on the coastline. So we did a large-scale data preference survey to document people's valuation of different size oil spills, or valuation of avoiding oil spills, and that's now become unit prices in the Norwegian Coastal Administration's handbook for cost-benefit analysis, and guides their decisions whether to do measures or not. So as a direct use of these valuation studies, and it was actually the Coastal Administration that came to us and said, we want to have, because they wanted to document the benefits of what they're doing, which is preventing oil spills. And so what we found out is that people care a lot about seabirds and seals, but also overall damages, of course, to all the marine life and recreational effects. And this is not permanent damages; it's kind of intermediate loss of ecosystem services. Yeah, so I think there is possibility. It's possible to but you need to take it from these the large body of environmental valuation studies, and actually also get the authorities on board to not only use it for environmental regulation, but also you can have a big impact by putting them into the cost-benefit manuals, because that's still a very much used tool in many sectors.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Sterling. The local, let's say, perspective that I ignore. I have to say, in my opening remark, I talk about Norway, but I didn't know there were problems even in Norway.
Oh,
so I'm disappointed now, but at the same time,
So we
more realistic.
So we didn't only beat Italy in football, but we also, as you can see, we also do bad to nature. Beating your nature.
Well, that's all over the same, I'm afraid. But thank you for your remarks on how to use cost-benefit analysis, and also on the interesting proposals. This nature tax sounds probably difficult to implement politically, but very close to what is needed.
Yeah. We have also suggested that you could have like the EU ETS, that you could have kind of a tradable quota. So you would give quotas to the municipalities. How much, based, but that has to also be based on kind of biodiversity assessments. So then you are in need of more information. I think, just to raise the awareness, and we managed also to get the biologists on board, because they usually are opposed to putting a price on nature, because then they, it has an indefinite value. I think they recognize. So we've been writing some articles for the newspapers also, together with the biologists, and saying that, look here, these also represents economic values and have to be taken into consideration. I mean, there are other value concepts, the IPBES also point out, but, this is, since cost-benefit analysis is still very much in use, this is a way to highlight the nature values.
This is a good example of the interdisciplinarity we were talking about even this morning. And if I may add, I have a funny, somehow, experience, because I hire a biologist in my team, because I needed to cover some topics. And it turned out that she was more favorable to ETS than me. Because she was seeing the use of pricing nature, And she was super enthusiastic.
Yeah.
And I had to say, okay, yes, sure, but still there are some aspects we should be cautious about. So somehow we inverted position, but it's a very...
And I think in, at our university I actually co-teach a course on nature conservation. And that textbook, which has been around for a long time, has a chapter on economic valuation. These are for the ecology students.
Yeah.
But I should say I was trained in my master's in natural resource management, so it's more like a biologist before I ventured into economics. So that also gave me the advantage of understanding, the opposition of the biologists. Some also see the value in valuing.
Exactly. Super interesting. Well, I promised 2 rounds of questions. Probably we can move on to the next round, which is the shorter one. I will ask you to reply in a few minutes, say maximum 5 minutes, so that we can have a conversation also with the audience. And I promise to ask more concrete questions after the general questions. I will start with Philippe, who went first. So my question to you, Philippe, would be what concrete measures can the EU take, or has taken already, to help integrate biodiversity into the emerging carbon markets, especially having the global south in mind?
Okay, you hear me? That's
yes.
Okay? Your question, so first I will be much more brief in this reply than the previous one.
So, Philippe, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes? Do you hear me?
We could hear you, but now it's pretty far away. So I don't know if you can try to...
I think I'm really speaking as close as I can from the microphone.
Okay, then we will be silent, promised. But try to speak loud as well, if you... Sorry.
Then I will speak very loud.
Okay. Okay,
So,
go ahead.
Put the microphone next to the screen.
What did... You hear? Yes?
A bit. We are trying to put a microphone closer, I think.
Hello, hello. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
The echo.
It's coming.
No, I think you can go ahead and we'll try to make the best out of it.
Okay. Somebody says on the chat we hear online very well. But that's online. So it's in the room that you don't hear well. Okay. What has the EU done in this respect? As you know, the carbon market is in place since a while, and there is we have not expanded that yet to nature credits, but we are working on it intensively with DG Environment and DG Klima. And I was very much interested by the presentation given by Stale, and this is what we need, we need concrete proposals. But you, Simone, you said, a tax is politically difficult. Of course, we all know this is politically difficult. But in times where the EU is always criticized for being obsessed by regulations, is it not the right time to recall that there are some simple instruments that are effective for environmental policies, and those should be used? The problem is that the competence for tax and fiscal policy requires unanimity in the Council, as you know, at EU level. But some member states can introduce taxes that change behavior. In Norway, they can if they want, and they do that when needed. In Denmark, they introduce a tax also in the farming sector, and in the other member states, they can do it. So I would challenge this idea that it's politically not feasible. But we need to go back because it's convenient for politicians to say, taxes, no, because it's unpopular, and then to accuse the Commission of being regulating too much. So that's one question, to say some reflection is in course on broadening the carbon market to include nature credits. I would challenge the idea that taxes should not be explored anymore. I think it's time to come back with simple instruments that have proven their impact and effectiveness. And third, the link to the global south, there I would just say that I'm not really competent for that. I think we best link also to the global south when we show that we are walking the talk. And when the EU is meeting its target, and when we show that it's feasible and affordable, then we are seen as credible partners with the global south, and we can propose to expand our tools with them. Because one of the risks, and I see this very much in the IPCC and other in IPBES, where I represent the EU, is that if we go too early to reach out to the global south, the mistrust is still too big, and any economical mechanism and instrument is seen as a way to avoid taking our own responsibility in Europe. So we can show that it works in Europe, that economic instruments do work, and then we can expand and discuss with other partners how to implement them with them.
Thank you, Philippe. So show first that it works here. So first do our homework and then try to expand things. And I particularly like what you were saying about the two levels, the EU versus national levels. There is certainly a tendency to give, to accuse, let's say, Europe of extra bureaucracy for anything. Sometimes Europe has been over-bureaucratic, over-regulating, but certainly it's an easy target, let's say, for local and national politicians. This is to be kept in mind. Alejandro, I come to you with a question on how can carbon market design be improved to ensure equitable participation and biodiversity co-benefits across regions.
So thank you for the question again. So, well, since it's so complicated with the slides, I will go without slides. So the first thing, well, these recommendations on my side are very similar to the ones we did 20 years ago, because the problem we have is, again, very similar. So we want to set up a market for carbon sequestration, but there is going to be incentives, and biodiversity is not incentivized directly. So then what you have to do is what the EU has proposed internally and has pushed to get outside, is to have this no harm. So you want to have a limit that you're not going to harm biodiversity. In the study I was referring before, they also saw that those voluntary markets where this was implemented, the harm was less. There was still harm, but less. So you have to have these limits, and it's a good thing. This is a good way we have started. So the other thing is moving forward. Shall we move into a dual crediting system? Also incentivizing biodiversity directly. It is very difficult, but it is possible. And as I said, in COP16, there are some discussions on how to do that, in COP16 in biodiversity. And I think really the two conventions should talk together to be able to do this. I don't think that is some. So on the one hand, the climate system should have it as a limit, not having biodiversity. But if you want beyond no harming, you need to work together and create a system that has dual crediting system. So the other thing which is very important is to scale up, go beyond this project-by-project approach, which is very complicated, very time-consuming, and we have seen it simply induces leakage. You don't deforest here, you deforest next by, so you have to have it at a higher scale. It can be a regional, it can be a national, that's to be defined, but you have to increase the scale. You cannot go into avoid deforestation in a very small area. That doesn't make sense. There's another study that has studied, quite simply, making an event study where it's a natural experiment in Mexico, where you see whether if you ask forest owners to protect their whole property, it is much more effective than if you ask them to only allow them to protect a share of your property. Because it's only a share, they will simply use the less efficient one and still continue extracting timber elsewhere. So at least it has to be the whole property, but actually you should go beyond that. It should be larger areas that you have to protect. But still, the main message, it's just 1 minute, is to say, so, okay, we had these two processes, actually three, and the United started in Rio. So we have the Framework Convention on Climate Change, we have the biodiversity, and the one on desertification. They started working separately, but now they're coming together, all three actually. Then we have another UN process which is kind of forgotten in this discussion on climate change, and that's the system of environmental economic accounting by the CEAERE. So we are saying we have to set up something that measures biodiversity. We have to something that measures ecosystem, and we have to take it into account in our climate discussion. But we are forgetting that we are setting up a system that is the CEAERE system, which is actually the same guys who do the GDP. So we trust them for doing a good job for doing GDP. They are setting up a whole system of accounts to measure biodiversity, to measure condition. So just use this as the limit that you need for the no harm. Use this to define properly markets that are based on that. This is going to be on all scales. I had a few slides. These are going to be real maps that you can scale at different levels. And there is mandatory. All countries in the world, there was in 2021, it was agreed, all the statistical offices in the world have to start doing this system of environmental economic accounts, ecosystem accounting. They are starting in 26 in Europe. In other countries, they will start later. There will be, at all scales, in form of maps, you will have condition. We, as a community, we failed because there was this thing whether we agreed also on doing monetary accounts, and in 2021 they decided we were not prepared to do the monetary accounts. So environmental economists, to some extent, we failed. I was very involved in this project. We tried to convince them we could go also for monetary. It was not possible. We have a paper in 2020 in Science saying that many people had started already doing it. So they have experiences. We in Andalusia did one, in the Netherlands did one. It has been done, but we were not able to convince this community. But they were convinced that you can go ahead with the biodiversity part. Norway has one of the most advanced ones for biodiversity, so you can do that, and we should use this information because this is another UN process. We should trust it the same way we trust them to estimate GDP.
Thank you, Alejandro. Again, very clear, insightful answer. I took some notes. I'd like to keep discussing about this, but let's give room to all our speakers. I move to Katinka for my second short question. In this case is, which institutional settings or incentive structures can best foster long-term international cooperation?
I think this is still a huge question.
I know, and it's short, it's even worse than before.
I would vote for this as one of the main questions for economics to try to give some insight to in the coming years. But so I will have a smaller focus also this time. But I will try to, in a few minutes, pull out some insights from the literature on international environmental agreements and the incentives. And there are many of different types in terms of detail. For example, we know from this literature on environmental agreements internationally that it's extremely important to think about the dynamics of these agreements. At the beginning, the literature focused typically on static settings where, let's say, you bargain over your contribution to a public good internationally, and typically the outcome would be that you contribute a little bit more, both in terms maybe of fairness, but also efficiency and bargaining power and so on. You contribute a little bit more if it's less costly for you to contribute. If you think about this in a dynamic setting, it's of course extremely important that it's not the case that if I invest in a lot of green technology in the next round of negotiations, I will have a huge burden because now it's cheap for me to contribute. That will disincentivize me from the investment in the first place. So you need to avoid these types of hold-up problems. Another insight from the literature is that it might be beneficial to link different problems. It might be possible to link trade agreements or parts of trade agreements to environmental agreements using carbon border adjustment mechanisms is of course an example of that in some sense. That might both reduce the problems of offshoring and these types of problems, and that I think is applicable also if you look beyond the climate problem. And Catherine Wolfram and others have worked where they discuss the possibility that these adjustment mechanisms can actually even incentivize countries to join cooperation and so on. And then there is a range of like much more detailed implications, like, okay, sometimes you can use the holder problem to create a larger agreement because it makes it more costly to go out of an agreement if that creates the holder problem, for example. That's but I think overall, one of the key insight that we have from this literature is that incentives, you need to think about the incentives of the individual countries, and that, I mean, the depressing overall conclusion of this literature is that it's extremely difficult to get large and deep environmental agreements. And that's, of course, also the insight that we have had from empirically from the climate negotiations that kind of ended in 2015 in realizing that we just have to start with countries making their contributions instead of making the agreement top down, basically. So which I think is obviously also, we need to think about this in all other areas in addition to climate change. And then I will end by mentioning one recent contribution by Bård Harstad and Anke Kessler, where they focus on the role of commitment, which I think is maybe kind of, looking at the literature as a whole, one of the most important insights that we have now, that at least an international agreement can pose as a commitment mechanisms for policymakers that are that face time and consistency problems, both because they do that even as one politician, but also because they know that there will be another politician in the future. And they also show that it can be vice versa. This commitment problem can be positive in a sense, because it can make politicians willing to go into agreements, because it pushes their predecessors to make more good policy. Okay, I will really stop there.
Which goes back to the dynamic aspect of the
Absolutely,
perspective.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Very interesting. This position, I can see things that cannot be seen from the audience because of the technical issue. And Alejandro had a very nice title, which was...
I can put on the slides.
No, but I not so new recommendations. And I don't want to diminish the value of what you're saying, but listening to you, I was thinking, of the papers by Caparrós in Iscalco on linking trade and environment back in the early 90s. I think that some good papers and some good principles are still valid, and we simply have troubles implementing them at the policy level, probably. Now, trade is even more difficult, but as economists, we know that linking topics can be a useful way to proceed. Okay, thank you for being able to stay in a few minutes on a very difficult question. And now I think it's time to open the questions to the floor, if any. Yes. 1, 2, 3. Many, not if any. Many. Do you need a microphone, maybe?
Maybe for
Philippe, can you hear from? Can you hear from the?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for. Thank you.
No, but it's okay.
Thank you very much for a very insightful panel discussion. My question is for Katinka regarding the first answer about pricing and subsidies and the different frameworks. We were hosting a policy session yesterday on the green agenda, and a lot of what we've talked about is public acceptance and how important it is to drive policy. And I would like to hear your thoughts about the balance between pricing may be more efficient from an economic perspective. They may lead to better choices, but as you noted, it's less likely to be well accepted by the public. And as we can see around Europe and the world, there is backsliding of environmental commitment because of public backlash against those policies. So, in the grand scheme of things, is it better to have less than perfectly optimal policies, but that would be accepted and implemented. So it's like a second best, instead of having pricing or more effective policies, but would not be implemented because, and actually may push negatively the whole, the public attitude towards environmental protection or climate action or environmental regulations.
Yes, so clearly the answer to your last question is yes. I mean, it's better to have a second best policy that does something than to have no policy. I think my part of my point is that, well, that's true, but it's also, but it's not better to have nothing, kind of, or to have a policy that does not obtain what you need to obtain instead of a good policy. And I think what we see, if we look at the world now, what is reducing emissions? Is it politically acceptable subsidies? Yeah, to some extent, yes. I mean, we have renewable energy subsidies that are important, but it's pricing. It's pricing that works, and we have a lot of pricing globally. So I think I find it difficult to accept that it is impossible. And I think my main point is that a few things, like the huge emission reductions, like the incentives for private capital to go into carbon capture and storage, these things is impossible to obtain without making it really expensive to fire coal, basically. Yeah.
I could say that many people find pricing difficult to accept. You find the fact that they don't accept pricing not acceptable. So we are stuck, but it's very interesting.
But you can frame that taxes in a way that makes it more publicly acceptable. And so when we do this stated preference survey, sometimes we put in different ways of actually taxing them, and there are differences. So if they know that either they change their behaviors, or there must be some alternatives so they can change behavior and not pay the taxes. But if they pay the taxes, I think they want to know that this may be earmarked for something. Even we don't like that word as economists, but I think that is to get this more publicly acceptable. So it's, for this nature tax, we suggested maybe that these funds would actually go into a fund, and then you could actually apply. Even the municipalities that were affected could apply to get money to restore nature that were already destroyed by these. And that kind of thing have been implemented for NOx emissions, for example. So that way of taxing you could also use for biodiversity. I think that would make it much more acceptable.
I think you have a...
I just, if I add something, I think I very much agree, and I think part of the reason, of course, that you are right, that people are skeptical of taxation is that when you tax something, if you think about the EV policy in Norway, for example, you have the alternative to make a regular car 50%, or let's say 22% more expensive, and cars are already expensive in Norway. There are lots of other taxes on car purchase, or you can, and people will feel that. I mean, normal families, it will hit their pocket, of course, and the alternative is to make the EV cheaper. The problem is that people only see one part of the equation here, right? We spend huge amount of public money on these subsidies, while of course the tax that you pay would go directly into some hospital or cancer medication or whatever, and people don't see the link. So I think a key to solving this problem would be to make schemes where, I mean, and you don't even need to earmark the money. I would be positive towards that too. You can say that you can push the money directly back to people through recycling schemes or whatever, and like 80% of families would be better off if you did that with taxes than they would with subsidies. But you could even link them to like things that you would do anyway, right? We make a cut in low income taxation, and we link the carbon tax. So I think here it's potential both for policy and also probably for the economics profession to contribute to understanding this better, how we can do this in good ways.
That's what we hope for.
Thank you. I think that Philippe had his hand up. Is it possible?
Yeah, I had my hand up, but just to ask, you're much more an expert. In my view, there is a way to stimulate the acceptability of taxes if who pays the taxes is better defined. It's not a 1 or 0 issue. And I'm sure you have many experts over there who can advise us on this. But I think that giving up on this instrument because it's not acceptable for the moment is too simple. And there are ways to address this. If those who pollute most or the richest do pay, the acceptability will be better. I think for the moment the problem is the distribution of the payment that is not acceptable.
Thank you. That's a clear statement.
I think it's... Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, it's working.
It's okay. So, thank you very much. It was super interesting, all the interventions, and this is really a very, very important topic, definitely. My question, maybe it's more directed to Stahl, and my question is for instance, we have nowadays in many countries, in Portugal is one example, where we have interventions like for instance, deployment of solar PV utility scale in land. And my point is, so how do you see, how can we in fact use valuation for that purpose? Because we'll have benefits and costs in the future. And so we need to, how do we measure, for instance, how people will value that land in the future? So, and this will be, so how do you see this problem? Because I think this is really key when we think about cost-benefit analysis in these contexts. So it's not what is going now, what's happening now, but also what is going to happen in the future. So this was just to listen to your thoughts on this issue. Thank you very much.
The inland, what was the issue you said first?
Solar PV utility scale, for instance.
Oh, the PV, yeah, okay.
We contribute to the climate goals, but we're destroying
landscape. This is pristine, and this is really something that, in Portugal, for instance, tourism is super important. For it's very relevant, and of course, it's not only because of that, but obviously this is an issue, and this is not only in Portugal. In many other places, right? Spain also, they have this problem. But I think also we are a small country, and it's, so I would like to listen to your opinion on this issue.
I think this is something that Katinka also mentioned, that sometimes, okay, so you want renewable energy, but that also has some negative external effects. So, photovoltaic in Norway, we had this big discussion on wind power, which is exactly the same thing. And we have, I actually didn't show that, but we have actually calculated the negative externalities, the external costs of wind power in Norway, which is roughly 5 eurocents per kilowatt hour, which is sizable. And that's based on this large-scale stated preference surveys. And we actually tried, you can, and it's basically the landscape impacts and biodiversity. Because biodiversity is also, especially in Norway, it's the birds that is affected. But in this case, we also looked at the benefits to the local communities. So because that's, of course, they would like them. It's a little bit like the vacation homes. So, there are benefits to the local, and there are negative impacts both, and there are benefits if it substitute fossil fuels. So we actually did, it was actually the people that did some kind of cost-benefit analysis from their own mind in this to kind of come up with a kind of, what are the net external effects, and is it positive or negative? And then that is what you would use to, if you wanted to have some taxation scheme.
Can I just add something? I think my question is more on the future.
Okay.
So you see, that's the point. Here we know how to do it. The problem is more on the future, like the benefits, because if we have this deployment of solar power panels for 30 years, in 30 years, how can we value now? How people value the land, in that. So that's my point. So this
So,
is what
yeah.
I think it's a big challenge. Yeah.
So that also has to do with, so these, then you have more like the scarcity value of biodiversity and land. And that's, that's been highlighted in, some recent, studies. And there's also increasingly a number of studies to look at that, how that, because that's going to actually counter some of the discounting you would get if you try to value it now. So we have to make a guess about people's preferences in the future for nature. We assume that they would be at least the same as today or maybe stronger, especially because of scarcity, and also because, you would expect maybe increased economic growth.
But suppose that you have like droughts, like in the south of Portugal, and this is going to disappear. So this is really, those benefits. So also the climate change also affects a lot of this, right? So
No, it's but it's
I think
future is difficult. It's the current generation deciding on the future.
Just to add something on what was said, so if we have a single intervention, doing a cost-benefit analysis is the ideal situation, I fully agree. But the thing is, we will have now multiple interventions, so we will have massive application of solar, but also other technologies. We will have massive things going on, and for that, doing each time a cost-benefit analysis is going to be complicated. So that's why what I mentioned before, the SEA, the ecosystem accounting, is so important, because this will be done at a national scale. It will be done on maps, so it will be done on a yearly or maybe 3 years basis, and it will have flow values, and it will have asset values. Because you have asset values, well, these asset values are calculated using the future and taking the future into account, because that's how we calculate asset values in when we do accounting. So the thing is, the answer is, the ideal situation is to do a cost-benefit analysis. I fully agree. But if you're not able to pay for cost-benefit analysis for every single intervention, which is going to be the case in most of the world, then you will have a system that allows you to get an approximate answer. And that's this ecosystem accounting if we fully develop it. And if we fully develop it, and we agreed to develop it only in biophysical terms, simply because we didn't put enough effort as a community to finish everything that you need to make it credible in economic terms. But at the end of the day, if you would have a fully fledged system that is credible in economic terms, the answer would be checking this year whether your intervention has a positive or negative effect.
Philippe, a very short add-on this.
Actually, it's not an add-on, but I have a burning question for Sally, or Sally, but I don't know if this is possible. If I can ask a question, if I can dare.
Burning but short?
The question is short.
Okay.
The answer, I don't know.
And then I collect the few questions, and we have to close in 10 minutes.
I'll be taking a concrete case that is relevant in my view. I was sort of traumatized by the nature restoration law and its impact assessment. Did any of you or any authors that you know of look at it ex post to analyze what were the main reasons for its watering down and dilution before its final adoption, but it was almost cancelled? Did anybody look at this? Because we see a lot of ex-ante studies, but I would like to see an analysis ex post.
If I may answer with a joke, we were expecting you to tell us. Okay, I will ask around, because it's hard, I guess, to do an ex post analysis on this aspect for methodological reasons. So it was not even born yet. So an ex post sounds a bit strange and difficult. But this is just my personal...
I meant ex post to the policy process. You know the story, you know how difficult it was to get it through. When I saw the impact assessment, I thought, oh, this is not very good. This is my personal opinion. And of course, there were many elements, and including the political situation. But I believe that part of the reason why the nature restoration law had a difficult journey is because the impact assessment was not sufficiently solid. And that's why with experts like those sitting in the room, we could actually learn for future similar initiatives.
I think this is a very good example of how to work together in the future. Maybe ex ante, before things get wrong, not only ex post. Yes, thanks, Philippe. And I will inquire in the community, I promise. There are some other burning questions, so I collect the questions and then we move towards the end.
Okay, thank you. I have a very short comment about the taxation and then a question. I agree that taxation is very great, but also biodiversity is not a homogeneous good as CO2 emissions are, so location very matters a lot. So I think it should be a combination out of different measures. So if you tax like resource use and land use change, that would be great because it's a driver of biodiversity loss, but you might also need to implement other measures like protected areas, etc. But I mean, I think this is general consensus. We just haven't talked about that. But now I have a specific question for Philippe Tulkens. So so I work on integrated assessment of climate change and ecosystem services. How do we get our research to the European Union, to the relevant people?
Simple question.
But
First, you need to produce documents that are of excellent quality, but this I have no doubt about. But they need to be also written in a language that can be understood by an EU civil servant or a national civil servant. And it needs to be provided through policy briefs that are really readable. And this is a major issue, while most of the knowledge is not reaching those who need to know, sometimes because it's just too long or it's too technical for them. We have quite good experts, but to be frank, we don't have much time to read. So therefore, the best way is to do this. The second thing that works quite well is when we organize clusters meetings, where we invite different projects, EU-funded projects, and we discuss directly with the civil servants from the different departments of the Commission. That is a kind of oral discussion, which helps, because often the colleagues have not had the opportunity to read the papers. So LinkedIn is also quite helpful when you have a publication that is readable by policymakers to catch their attention, and so on. There are multiple ways, but nobody has the silver bullet for that.
Thank you. Move to the next question.
It's more a comment about this nature tax. I'm also a Norwegian and I have some experience with sitting in all these commissions for 10 years and suggesting this nature tax. And the suggestion along the way has been to at least start with the nature tax that are based on carbon emission from land use changes. That's a possible starting point, and you can have that for a different kind of land. And that has been. I think it's eventually going their way through the what you call it, the political climate department. I think there are knowledge there. So it's even if as an economist we have to suggest solutions, and we also often suggest pricing. And I think it's we just have to start with that, and we have to start with it's not going to be perfect. We are not looking for a first best solution, maybe not the second best or the third best, but at least to put some prices. I really agree with Katinka about that, because it's a way we need to change the relative prices, and if we are only making something more cheaper, then we will not be able to change the consumption or the path towards a more sustainable path. So we really have to not only rely on the subsidies. And I also have some comment about the scarcity of land. I think in Denmark they are having this very ambitious climate policy of changing the land use from agriculture to more to planting forest. And I think it's something is happening to the land market in Denmark, because they see the investors see that it's going to be more and more scarce, so they are starting to buy and put, but the prices are increasing on the different kind of lands. So that's not with any price. The only regulation is the regulation of they have decided to plant more forest change. So it's working. Different kind of regulations. Thank you. So do you have any comments on that?
I think it's a matter of understanding, and so to a certain extent a follow-up question to this last comment. So if I understood properly, Katinka, you were mentioning that it would be, how can I say, feasible or appropriate to set a single price instrument to address both climate change and biodiversity loss, but then there are some economic results in the literature that present a major challenge of setting independent policy goals that are, or say, more independent policy goals than the policy tools that we have. Yes, so I wonder whether we risk sort of oversimplifying by assuming that one instrument can sufficiently internalize multiple complex externalities. So in the end of the day, there is sort of a trade-off between the simplicity and feasibility from one side, so even political feasibility, versus the effectiveness from the other side.
Can I answer just very quickly?
Go ahead.
I absolutely didn't mean to say that this one instrument will solve everything. Absolutely not. I completely agree with you. But I think my main point was that taking biodiversity into account kind of adds to the argument of using pricing for carbon emissions. Yeah.
Two final questions.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Actually, I wanted to answer your question. So you mentioned basically like the trade-off between like solving climate change by like a solar panel, then the impact on like biodiversity, and also like towards the future, like also trade-off like between the valuation today and the future. That's I think very important question, and that was the topic of the forthcoming OECD Environment Outlook, and so we talked about those like the synergy and trade-off of like the climate change and various types of pollution and biodiversity loss. And by using like an economic simulation model linked with integrated assessment model with all biophysical like the details of the environmental aspects, I have to admit, of course, like a specific to like Portugal and all the details, is a global model, so that's a bit of a limitation there. But nevertheless, like we think of the trade-off and today and also towards the future. So at least I wanted to mention that. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question goes to Sampo. Sampo's connected online. It's always a pleasure to see you. And Sampo, the floor is yours for a question or comment.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll echo.
Yeah, we can hear very well.
Okay, I try to resist. I bring a Finnish experience on this because I think it is reality in Finland that we would have a land use change fee. It has been assessed by ministry, and it may be reality in future if the future governments are willing to progress it. And it is currently envisioned to be including a carbon portion or a component, but it of course could have also a biodiversity component. And in the chat I also put our working paper that studies this nature loss fee, as we put it. So I think with a one tool with also biodiversity and carbon components, these two elements could be combined.
Thank you, Sampo, also for referring to your work and to Phil, is it muted?
No, we are muted because I tried to.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. I was simply thanking you for providing these insights on Finland and on your own work that connects perfectly to the discussion on nature taxation we had. Unfortunately, time's up. I wanted to say a few words to conclude, but instead of summing up and giving my takeaways, just one takeaway. This is impressive that after 1 hour and 45 minutes, we could go on much more, and that panelists were asking questions to the audience was answering to the questions of the audience. I mean, I lost control, to be honest. But at the same time, this shows that the kind of friendly, lively conversation that I really dream of. And I think that more of this is needed on the way to COP30, as was in the title, because, and here I refer to Philippe, this is a community that wants to bring some scientific results to the policymakers. So we will keep doing this, we will try to improve, and also this conversation with you, Philippe, and with other policymakers helps us shaping our research. So thank you all for the participation.
Thank you.